Hi, everyone. We are here at the Learning Salon and we're in the same location. This is not a simulation, this is real. We are extremely excited to have Oriel FeldmanHall today, who is a professor at Brown, and her lab works at the intersection of cognitive neuroscience and computational models, and works on very interesting range of problems, from social learning, from rewards and punishments, to sometimes moral learning. And there's a range of very fantastic methods that they use. I'm always very impressed when I talk to Oriel or when I see one of their papers or preprints out from the lab. And so I'm extremely excited to have the session. We are currently at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, where we are at a conference, NACIS, from neuroscience to artificial intelligence systems or something. And it's been fantastic to see everyone in person, which is why we are here in person. All right, so without further ado, remember that the Learning Salon is an interdisciplinary forum for discussing the intersection of learning in biological and artificial agents. We are interdisciplinary, so if you have a question, don't consider it dumb. Just ask your questions in the Ask a Question area and vote on each other's question. And if you don't really want to be invited to screen, please just say, ask for me. Otherwise, we might invite you to the screen. If you have other questions, clarification questions during the talk, please add it in the chat. Maybe we can answer, or feel free to add it in the Ask a Question area. And please be mindful of being respectful in the discussions. Disagreement is completely accepted as long as it's respectful. Without further ado, Oriel, we're very excited. Please share your screen. We're very looking forward to your wonderful talk, and it's a great title that people would know we are very sympathetic to.
All right, thank you so much for having me. Let me share my screen now, hopefully successfully. Let's see. Okay. Can you see it?
Beautifully, yes.
Okay. Super. Oh, now, so how do I make you guys big? Or I just have to like look at my screen twice or something? Okay.
I can hear you. We can hear you. And once you're done, you will.
I'll unshare.
Exactly. You don't need to see us during your talk.
Yeah.
I will mention if something is on fire or we can't see you, I'll text you and I'll tell you.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for inviting me on here and having me on to the Learning Salon. I was doing a little bit of my homework and watching some past people give talks here, and I was very impressed by both their talks, but also in the nature of the questions that you guys ask. And I'm excited to have this conversation, although also a bit nervous because you're gonna go for the jugular, I'm sure. and I guess part of the reason that I decided to talk about this idea that reward is not enough is because even though I've been thinking about it in various manifestations for some time now, it's only in the last few years that it's started to congeal in this way. And that's largely a byproduct of the conversations and the work that I've done with one of my graduate students, Joey Hefner, whose work I'm going to talk about today. And he's really been pioneering in the type of studies that we're working on in regards to emotion and how it plays a role with reward. So before I start talking about reward not being enough, which I thought was perhaps an incendiary title and also timely given some of the papers that have been coming out recently, I want to talk about why reward is so front and center in so many different fields. So if we think about reward and we contextualize it within the domain of psychology, it's played a really central role, in particular in learning and decision making, as far back as Skinner. And if we actually think about it, it goes beyond Skinner. It probably goes to Thorndike, because if we invoke Thorndike, he even was thinking about how reward plays out in the learning space. And a short way of saying that is that reward has been dominant in the field of psychology for more than 100 years, which is a really long time. And we can see evidence of that if we type reward and decision or decision reward into Google Scholar. We get like a hit rate of whatever, 2.4 million. So there are a lot of people talking about and studying reward in the context of decision making and learning, and there's really good reason for that, right? So if we think about all the different types of decisions that we make on a daily basis, whether it's, you know, ordering off of a menu or picking our social partners, selecting our jobs, deciding who to spend time with, and so on and so forth, all of these types of choices rely in some part on reward. Um, and if we focus a little bit more narrowly and we think about just learning and decision making, reward is the common denominator from everything that includes, you know, stimulus response learning to goal directed decision making and everything that falls in between, even in areas that are not squarely in psychology. So, like, for example, in artificial intelligence. And so, in under all of these frameworks, whether you're doing stimulus response or reinforcement learning, there is one goal, and that is to maximize reward. Now, at the worry of sounding like a little bit pedantic, I wanted to pause for a moment because I think it actually might be quite useful to have a working definition of what reward is. So, a lot of us here talk about reward. We study reward, we think about reward a lot. And when I was putting this talk together, I wanted to get a definition of reward because I didn't want to get stuck in sort of a semantic argument for 30 minutes about, you know, what exactly is reward, what do we mean by it. And so I started going through papers looking for a definition of reward, and I actually found a hard time finding a good definition in recent work that says, okay, this is exactly what we mean about reward, even though we're talking about it, we're studying it, this paper and this paper and this paper is all about reward. But there are a few definitions out there that I really like. And actually, one of them is Thorndike's, and he said reward increases frequency or the intensity of a behavior. Another one I like from way back when is Pavlov, and he said reward is an object that produces behavior change. And then a more current one that I'm quite favorable to is Bain's, which says that rewards are things given in recognition of effort and achievement. Now, in each one of these different definitions of what reward is, everything is external. So, for example, it might be money if you're human, or food if you're human, or food if you're an animal, some sort of vegetative object. Now, I study humans, and in particular, I study how humans interact with other humans. And so in our lab, what we most often use to quantify what people value in their interactions with others is money. And I want to put space in between the idea or definition of reward and value, which has a subjective component. Okay, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, if we look specifically within the domain of learning and decision making, basically all models operate on reward. And one of the most elegant examples of how reward functions to support learning is through the prediction error. And I'm sure this audience doesn't need any introduction to what the prediction error is, but in short, it's if you expect a reward at a certain time point, but it fails to occur, then you have this negative prediction error because your expectation has been violated. And when our expectations about the world are violated, we can learn a lot about the environment that we are in, and we can titrate our behavior accordingly. So this is a dominant model of human and animal learning. And the prediction error framework has also been co-opted in the social domain to explain how people learn about and from others. So for example, we could learn about another's trustworthiness, their trustworthiness or their generosity simply by relying on a prediction error framework. And there's pretty good evidence in the literature to suggest this. But in all of this work that I've talked about thus far, there's sort of this elephant in the room. I would call it an elephant in the room primarily because I was trained by affective neuroscientists, and that is the role of emotion. So we know in sort of ancillary fields that emotion and choice are intimately linked. So emotion has this really powerful operation in how we move about the world. And whether that is like construed as, let's say, a physiological response or a self-report, so asking people, how angry are you? We know that it can influence choice. It can influence choice. It can also influence some types of learning. So for example, fear learning, but not really value-based decision making and learning like the way that we think about it, or that I think about it in regards to the work that we study. And part of the problem is that in the world of value-based decision-making and learning, emotion is treated either as a nuisance variable or it's considered synonymous with reward. But I don't think that's true, in part because of my training, in part because of the data I'm about to show you. But we started thinking about this concept of whether it really was emotion and reward are synonymous with one another. And we thought, well, let's see if that's true. Let's consider how emotion might play a role in human learning and decision making. And we thought, given the success of the prediction error count, perhaps this is a really good framework for applying the role of emotion in how we learn about the world. So emotion might provide a very useful signal during social choices that extends beyond reward. And we thought about this in the role of emotion expectations. So emotion might act on expectations and violations of these expectations, essentially just like an emotion prediction error, just like a reward prediction error would. So I think it's best if I illustrate with an example. And this is, of course, a toy example. I'll give you just a few to give you a flavor of how we think about it. So let's say you live in a department where you have some colleagues that are good and some colleagues are bad, or less congenial, and you've been avoiding collaborating with one particular colleague because he might be aloof or grumpy or whatever it might be. But for whatever reason, you have to collaborate with him. And once the collaboration begins, you discover that he is actually quite warm and humorous. And so you have this unexpected joy of working with this colleague, which produces a positive emotion prediction error, which might motivate more extensive future collaborations. So we can also imagine a situation in which the prediction errors for reward and emotion actually go in the opposite direction. So if we take the example of, let's say, you're negotiating an offer with a new company, and you've been in these back and forth conversations with your boss that are, not very positive at all. He's being super difficult and trying to shortchange you, whatever it might be. And then finally the offer comes through, and you open it and you find it's so much better than what you expected. And so here you have this positive reward prediction, but you have this negative emotion prediction error. So the argument that I want to put forward today and sort of debate with you guys is this idea that reward, even though it's been the focus of so much of learning and decision making over the past 100 years, is actually not enough. And that emotion makes an independent contribution to value above and beyond reward, and thus motivates choice in a very powerful way. So let me spend just a few minutes giving you some data that I hope will convince you of this argument that emotion and reward make independent contributions to value. All right. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this little spiel, this work was led by one of my graduate students, Joey Hefner, who figured out a very clever way to measure emotion prediction errors. So there are lots of different ways to think about emotion, but we co-opted a model of emotion that partitions emotional experiences into the two core affective dimensions of valence, which is essentially pleasurableness, and arousal, which is alertness. And so in our studies, we have our subjects use a mouse, just like I have here, to report their emotions on a very fine-grained 500 pixelated grid. And we've directly borrowed from the logic in RL, which operationalizes prediction errors by the distance between the expectation of reward and the actual reward received. So if we take this grid space, if a person is reporting their emotional expectations, that is, I think I'm going to feel this way, they might say that they're expecting to feel, let's say, slightly positively aroused, which means that they would click here. Can you guys see my mouse?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, wonderful. Um, and they would click here in this grid, and it would be recorded by this particular XY coordinate, let's say 150 by 80. And so then they have this social interaction with another person, and they're again asked to report their actual emotion. And then they might move the cursor up here to say, that they're feeling negatively valenced and highly aroused, which is a negative 100 and 200. And so what we can do is we can compute this arousal PE, which is here in red, and a valence PE, which is here in blue, based on the difference between these two XY coordinates. And one strength of doing this is we can directly compare these emotion prediction errors to reward prediction errors. That's how much money was expected versus received in a social task. So just to give you a flavor of the type of social tasks that we use, we've used a whole bunch, but here's just one. A lot of times in our lab we use economic games. So one of the simplest games is the ultimatum game. There are two subjects. Let's say Ida and I are playing together. I'm player A and Ida's player B. I'm given $10 and I can offer whatever I want to Ida as player B. She has the choice to ultimately accept the offer, in which case we get the money as I offered it, or she can reject the offer, in which case neither one of us gets any money. So it's a very costly decision, or it could be a costly decision if she decides to reject and essentially punish me for making an unfair offer. So what we have our subjects do is make a prediction when they see who they're about to play with. What do you think, in this case, let's say Thomas is going to offer you? Then we say, okay, how do you feel about the offer that you're expected to receive from Thomas? And we ask you to, make your prediction on the circumplex. Then you find out that actually Thomas is a big jerk and he only gives you 10 cents. And so we say, how do you feel now about his offer? And finally, we ask you to make a decision. Do you want to accept the money as is, or would you like to reject the offer that Thomas has made you? Now, as I described before, what we can critically do is we can use these two dimensions of arousal and valence to compute two different types of prediction errors. And the beauty of this is that we can compare it directly to this reward prediction error, which is actual minus predicted amounts of money in this particular task. And so one of, or I should say, three of the benefits of computing emotion prediction errors in this way is that in the field of emotion and affective science, there's a lot of nebulousness about what is exactly emotion, how do we quantify it, and so this type of system allows us to precisely compute prediction errors for different emotion dimensions. It does not rely on specific discrete emotions such as guilt or regret. So we don't have to say, like, are you feeling guilty, or did you feel regret for behaving in a certain way? And finally, it allows us to test different types of prediction errors against one another, in this case, emotion and reward. Okay, so let me show you what we found. What I'm graphing here is the type of prediction error that was best at predicting decisions to punish in the ultimatum game by the three different types of prediction errors that I discussed. Negative values essentially reflect negative prediction errors. So that would be less reward, less pleasantness, which is valence, or less arousal than expected. So first, what you find is more arousal than expected leads to greater punishment. Less pleasantness than expected also leads to greater punishment. And finally, when we compare reward, we find that less reward than expected also leads to greater punishment. But what we can do is we can submit these three different prediction error types to their regression betas to a coefficient test. And we can directly test which is strongest in predicting choices to punish in this case. And what we find is that essentially valence prediction errors trump all. They trump reward prediction errors and they trump arousal prediction errors. And we've run lots of variants of this study using different games, different amounts of money in the laboratory, online. I think Joey will probably correct me if once I say this number, right? But I'm pretty sure we've run it on more than 1,500 people at this point. And this effect is pretty stable across the board. We find this effect despite the game and despite whether we're running it in the lab or online. And so the two takeaways from this is that one, there's a unique contribution of reward and emotion prediction errors to social choices. And second is that the valence prediction error is the strongest prediction error. It outperforms reward prediction errors. So this is, pretty good evidence, we would say, pretty compelling first evidence that there's independent contributions of emotion and reward. But we can do further testing of how independent these contributions really are. So these data suggest a particularly privileged role for the violations of emotional expectations in guiding behavior in these social interactions. And because of that, they have really important implications for mood disorders such as depression, which are often characterized by impairments in both reward and emotion processing. And a lot of the literature over the past couple of decades has these two concepts quite muddled together. And you see some evidence that it's reward, some evidence that it's emotion, and there's not a lot of clarity of what's guiding sort of maladaptive decisions and behaviors that you see in depression. So this means that it's sort of unclear which signal, emotion or reward, is the primary contributor to these socially maladaptive behaviors, such as, let's say, anhedonia. So what we did is we collected two different groups, those with depression and a healthy control group. And when we compared these two groups using the paradigm I just showed you with the emotion and reward prediction errors, what we find is that individuals with depression use reward prediction errors to the same degree as healthy controls. So there was no difference whatsoever. But when we looked in the domain of emotion, we found that they did not use arousal prediction errors basically at all. And they had significantly attenuated reliance on valence prediction errors compared to healthy controls, which shows us that depression is associated with intact reward Ps, but impaired emotion AEs, further showing that there's some independence between these two concepts. Okay, so just to, I feel like I've been talking for a while now. So just to really quickly sum up before you break this all down, or you make me think about this in a more sharp way, what I just showed you very quickly is that emotionally valenced prediction errors like disappointment are motivating decisions to punish and to forgive, and a host of other types of social choices. That emotions and reward PEs are independent, and that we find further evidence of independence between these two constructs in the realm of depression, where we see that reward PEs are intact, but there's an impaired reliance on emotion prediction errors. So I guess I will leave it there, and then we can talk about the data.
First of all, thank you so much. Great talk. It's there are so many deep directions to discuss this, and it makes me realize I would love to immediately start collaborating with you, but I will first wait for John to ask his questions if you want.
Oh,
before,
okay.
or I can start however you prefer.
No, fine, sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really interesting. So, you mentioned at the beginning that some people just equate reward and emotion, right? They just it comes up a lot on the Salon. When is a term on the same level as the others, or is one term superordinate and the other ones are kind of subordinate? I think my mother likes to watch romantic comedies, right? And I think she quite enjoys the sort of roller coaster of a little bit of a tearjerker component, and then it's a happy ending kind of thing, right? Yeah. Romantic comedies have this almost rigid formula, right? So there are moments when you kind of enjoy the sadness before you then get the happiness. So in a situation like that, it seems to me that the emotional roller coaster is what you're actually wanting to ride to be rewarded. You enjoy. So in that scenario, it seems to me that the emotional roller coaster is what you want as your reward for watching the romantic comedy, right? So in that scenario, they don't seem so independent to me. And then with respect to the, this is something that I've had to face in work going back years, where you never know how to compare units across measurements, right? So in other words, if you have units of reward, like in dollar amounts, and units on the grid of valence, how do you know that you've matched them? In other words, is there some unitless space where in this 3-axis space, 3 units of valence and 2 units of arousal equal 4 units? So I wonder sometimes if you don't have a space where you know that they're calibrated to each other, that you don't know how do you in the regression really know that you've got the real answer versus it's been constructed out of the fact that you don't really know how to calibrate these variables against each other. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words,
Totally.
So those are my sort of questions, which are sort of related in so much that orthogonality is hard, right? In other words, if you want to make a case about independence, you want to believe that your measures are orthogonal. In the romantic comedy, they don't seem to be. And then because of that, I wonder when it comes to the units, they may be orthogonal, but you don't know whether the distances traveled on that 3-dimensional space, you know that you've matched properly. I mean, it sounds almost insuperably difficult, but I was just wondering about those 2 issues first.
Right. Okay. So the answer to, I'm going to have a potentially unsatisfying answer to both. The answer to the first one, statistically, is we can put them on the same scale just by standardizing them. I mean, I think we're doing a little bit of hand waving and juggling to get them into the same space. So your question, I think, still stands. But I would argue that that question of what you're posing, you could pose to many, many researchers on many, many scientific variables that all go into the same regression. And so is a critique that is important to consider, but applies to regressions in which we're oftentimes trying to control for one and look at the importance of the other controlling for that, when they don't operate on the same scale. I mean, that's the simple answer. That we use, statistical methods to try to get them on the same scale. That being said, I don't think they're on the same scale. What do I think emotion does independently? Which brings me to to answering the first question in reverse order. I don't think that emotion and reward are always independent. I think that there are cases in which they're actually quite well aligned. And so I gave 2 examples at the beginning where they can both go in the same direction. And then I gave the second example is when they sort of diverge from one another. But Joey's actually doing some follow-up work now, where he's trying to understand the boundary conditions of when emotion and reward prediction errors are independent versus are not. And in the conversations that we've had and that we've batted around, in large part because we're trying to put this in the scanner, and so we want as much orthogonality as possible for power issues. We think that it's far more likely that reward and emotion prediction errors align or are less independent in the domain of non-social decision making than in the domain of social decision making. So you gave an example of your mother, who has these sort of frameworks and expectations of what she wants to watch and how she wants to feel as a rom-com sort of unfolds. But there are many cases in the social world where something might have a rewarding value but be emotionally unpleasurable, or vice versa. And the decoupling, at least as we think about it, is much more natural in that space than in the non-social domain. But I do want to say that I don't think that they're strictly independent. I think there are cases when they do align.
So yeah, and I was just wondering, as a possible solution, do you think there can be a prediction error on the prediction errors? In other words, that where you might get the change is when there's you get surprised by the fact that the grumpy person smiles, and yet they also smile, but they give you a smaller amount of money than you expected. And so in other words, it's really the prediction error on the congruence of the prediction errors. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, that you could imagine the smiling person being really miserly is a prediction error because the two went in different directions on the axes. So it's like a meta prediction error. Did you see what I'm saying? Do you think that could have a role in sort of deriving sort of a higher level variable?
I do. And actually, Joey has also explored this question already, with which we have data on, unpublished data. It's construed under a slightly different framework, but essentially what happens is that the emotion prediction error is more powerful than the reward. Again, in this case, it's we show these grumpy faces with different reward reinforcement rates that have different volatilities in them. And then you have like a person who's happy and who aligns with the reward rate and reward reinforcement schedule, and then like a grumpy face. And the essentially what happens is that you, we're still working through the results a little bit, but what essentially happens is that to be working with, even though the reward rate and its volatility might be the same between these two individuals, the fact that it's coming from someone who aligns with like being happy, I mean, these are very like stripped back, sort of laboratory tasks, is a far more pleasurable experience of which you're willing to like learn more and take more on from the person who is smiling at you and giving you that positive emotional social feedback than even though when the reward rate and its schedule is matched with a grumpy individual. Does that sort of answer your question or dance around it a little bit?
And then my final question, when we've got that we're living in a world of sort of warring normative models, right? Minimizing free energy, maximizing reward. We just heard a talk about, just wanting to get best prediction. I was just wondering that what's not on those axes, I mean, you've got reward and you've got emotion. What about doing things for a reason? In other words, what about just doing something because you reasoned through that it should be done? In other words, where is that in this? We don't just do things for rewards and emotions. We may have to just reason it through, right? So where does that fit in this framework? I mean, we think, surely we plan and think about things we should do, not just, is it going to be rewarding? Is it going to have high valence? Is it going to be arousing? I'm just wondering where reasons come into all this.
Well, I guess I would argue that when you're reasoning through something and going down some sort of decision tree, part of the reasoning, I should say at least that I do, I can only like speak from my own personal experiences, but it would be interesting to hear what you do, is that reasoning evokes emotional properties for me. So if I'm like, you know, let's say negotiating an offer, trying to figure something out, playing through what it might be like to live in X place or have, you know, Y colleagues or whatever it is, has a, you know, an emotional landscape that of course, I cannot truly live out on, but I can imagine and I can have be part of my reasoning process. Now, it doesn't have to be such a consequential, you know, choice, but if you're thinking about, let's say, like breaking up with someone and you think about, you know, the pros and the cons, you know, it's just like talking a friend through one of these very issues. A lot of the properties that come through talking through all those decision trees are emotional in their flavor. And so I would say that it's very hard to decouple reasoning from a lack of emotional experience.
So, you know, I was thinking, you know, you say, well, you know, I have to go and get that vaccination, or it's time to get that checkup, you know, and you just make the decision based on, you know, makes sense. It seems to me that that's not really, I mean, I guess you could imagine what the negative consequences would be down the road if you don't do it, I suppose. But it just seems to me the more proximal reason for the decision is you just said, yeah, it's time, I should do this. It just seems slightly different to, you know, am I going to
like a heuristic, like using a heuristic?
Maybe. It just feels like it's just another axis. I agree with you. How orthogonal doing things for cold, rational reasons, you know, is different from heating it up with, you know, emotion or the desire for reward. It just seems to me that there's a family of axes, including reasons, emotions, arousal, rewards, and sometimes they're more separated and orthogonal, other times it's difficult to know. Do you think maybe what we really need is sort of more pluralistic constellation of things that in different contexts weight differently on our decisions, and that we shouldn't be looking for the omega variable?
Can I say something here?
Yeah.
So I think that's something that, let me see, John, if you agree with this kind of framing. And I think that there's something very profound about what Oriel is saying. So first, I think the dissociation of external rewards versus how does it make you feel, how does it register for me, is important. For instance, your mom might like rom-coms, I might like horror. So I might actually get extremely bored and not finding interesting when at the end of things, everything is happy ending and a wedding, right? Somebody else might like science.
That's a horror as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly, yes. exactly. So the important thing is that I think the very important point that Oriel is making, that I feel like is a very similar point to, and Oriel, I hope that you join us for Boris Gotking's session, that who will join us, and also Chris Summerfield, because they both have related work in one way or other. So Boris Gotkin, for instance, showed that instead of looking for the rewards outside, let's look at the homeostatic effect that it has internally. And Summerfield had this TICS paper where they reviewed this idea of where does value come from. That was their term. And then they were also saying we need to look at the internal landscape of how external things register. And for you and me, obviously, it might register differently. For instance, I might like chocolate, you might like vanilla, for instance. or we both might like chocolate. This is like, so and so I think the very interesting point that this kind of thinking might bring about is a different philosophical way of thinking about things than the maybe enlightenment rational subject idea, because it's not going to be the same rewards, or it's not going to be the same external quote unquote rewards or reinforcement, as John Kuby correctly mentioned on the in the chat, is not going to lead to the same kind of register as the same kinds of pleasant, unpleasant axis in my internal landscape. And because of that, the kinds of reasons that some person versus another person might be engaging with, it depends on, are they sharing value with regards to what counts as good reasons? And very easily, if we are not on the same page about certain values, it might be that reasoning might diverge with the same method of rational reasoning. And I think Antonio Damasio did a good job of showing that, there are patients that have damage to parts of the brain that you would consider emotional, but actually they lack reasoning, because it turns out we use affect in reasoning. So I just wanted to say this as like a kind of before Oriel gives her response, that I feel like you, John, have really pointed out to an important philosophical consequence of this idea of separating external reward from internal consequences, or how internally we process those rewards. And also about whether we want a pluralism, as opposed to whether we want to really rethink the inherent connection between emotion and reason. Are we trying to say, oh no, emotion is its own space and reason is its own space, and there's sometimes correlation? Or do we want to say, no, they're inherently linked, because those are different philosophies?
Yeah, so I think that's great. So I think, I might have an answer that marries both of your points together. One way that we've been thinking about the emotion prediction error count is that it is the signal that takes the external rewards from the food and the money and whatever it might be, and it turns it into value. So how we subjectively care, how much we care about something, or what that signal is internally. I mean, we're searching for that now on a neurobiological level. So I don't have any evidence, and I don't want to make too strong of a conjecture. But one thing that I think that is at least drawn me to this account is its parsimony. So I appreciate the space that I play in intellectually, which is social decision making and learning. The complexity of that space is tremendous, and it's really hard to make things tractable in the laboratory with also holding its veridicality to the real world, in the sense that a lot of the experiments that we do in the lab are so stripped back from reality of the way that we interact with people, that can we actually really learn anything? So how do we, merge the wanting for precision with, the lack of ecological validity? And for me, I think that there's something because there's so much sort of complication and muddiness in the social space that we're already playing with, there's something elegant and beautiful about the idea that an emotion prediction error could be parsimoniously explaining so many different things that we do. At least I could say, in the social domain. I know I'm not quite keeping track of all of the things that are happening in the chat, but someone mentioned animals, and I don't really feel comfortable getting into the debate of, what does a rat feel, or does it feel? Is there good evidence of empathy, which, some papers have shown? I would probably get myself in trouble very quickly if I started going down that road. But in humans, where emotion is both unconscious and conscious, depending on how you experience it and what the context is, I think that there is something sort of Occam's razor about it that you don't have to suffer from plurality of like the complexity of like putting all the bells and whistles onto every single thing to get you the most complicated system of how the human brain interacts with another human brain.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was just imagining, if you were to do some sort of, in decision making, some sort of principal component analysis or factor analysis on the big juicy objects that affect decision making, right? And how many of them are there? And when are they in conflict? When are they correlated? And are we in the end, in the field of decision making, looking, as I said before, for the omega variable that all the others, the ring that rules them all, right? And when you have reward is enough, it looks like reward is the ring that rules them all, and then you have others. And I'm just wondering, do you have that view that there's going to be, a omega variable, or that there's just as you said, even though the world seems so complex, what's so fascinating about experiments like yours is that you can actually surprisingly reduce them to a manageable number of axes, right? Is that the project, to sort of manage to take complex decision making and show that you can wait on a few key components like emotion and reward? Is that the project? Do you think that the complexity is actually not as complex as you think, that you've actually got these axes that you're talking about that can do a lot of explanatory work?
That is such a good question. And I think it's such a good question because I don't have a good answer, in the sense that I, in my own mind, don't have clarity on what I want. I guess, um, in some ways, like when I think about science, when I think about doing, I try, we try to go in with a hypothesis, but I try to really let the data lead me without getting too bound to a way of thinking, in the sense that I don't want to be married that the world has to be this way, that it's all about reward, it's all about emotion. Reward is not enough. Because I think the flexibility and the nimbleness of thinking allows you to be more true to the properties of the human mind. And so my answer to you is, I don't know, maybe the reason I am thinking about it the way I am thinking about it right now and framing it as emotion prediction errors or potentially an omega variable is because I find that as our lab is trying to scale up in the complexities of how we study social decision making, we're having a tremendously difficult time basically reflecting the outside world in the laboratory, and we're so cognizant of that, and so I'm trying to hold on to something that feels easier, and maybe that is the stripped down complexity that, as you're mentioning, but that could be my own psychological need being brought into the experiments. So how's that for walking around?
No, I think, as you said, a while back, these are things that we all face, right? And I just think that it's made more apparent when you're doing something that, real world social interactions, it's what's more real world than that, right? It's almost like you're under pressure to be closer to the real world than lots of other kinds of neuroscientists, right? Because you can have a simple motor learning task or a simple memory task, and you're not going to, whereas what's a simple stripped down social task, right? You have to be more imaginative, I think. You have to actually straddle that line in your work better, right? That's it seems to me, right? And and if you do get some sort of, and did you feel like you can get some sort of, you do the experiment in the lab and then you have a more ecological experiment? Does anyone try to sort of correlate what people are like in your sort of stripped down experiments where you can actually get data, and then you can sort of maybe retrospectively look at the way, like you mentioned, how they date, how they're always breaking up, they never seem to find the right person. Has there been any ground truth validity to some of the in-lab experiments and prediction on the way people lead their lives, or is that just too big an ask?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So that's a great question. So actually, the very first PhD experiment that I ever did, my first experiment that I ever did, full stop, was we had this, I was trying to figure out a way to test altruism in the lab and have it feel real and not be like a trolley dilemma. And so this is like a decade ago now, or more rather. But what we did is we created this task, we called it the pain versus gain task, where we basically incentivized people to electrically shock another person. And they had to watch it unfold. And we found these huge discrepancies between the hypotheticals. So like if you asked it in a trolley, esque like dilemma, put it in a scenario on a piece of paper, people would be like, oh, how could you even ask me this question? I would never do that. And then, of course, when 200 pounds sterling was on the line, they were taking, only one person of the 150 we ran didn't take the money. But what we did, one of the experiments that we did is we scaled up in the realness of that experiment. So from the vignette version where it was just, written on a piece of paper, yes, no binary choice, to, okay, how much money would you give up, to simulating all the properties of like meeting the other person that you're about to shock, sitting down with them, but then having to imagine the shocks and not actually doing it, to doing the whole thing in real time and having it be real. And what we found was that amount of money that was kept, so our index of selfishness actually scaled quite beautifully with how real the paradigm got. So that is some evidence of the fact
So
that when you try,
they were most selfish in the realer, or the more, when was their selfishness at its worst? The more real the situation was?
yeah.
How
So
awful.
like in the hypothetical scenario, you give up all the money. Of course, I would never shock anybody. Like, don't be silly. Versus, you were keeping a lot of the money, 2/3 of the money in real time. But it would scale. Make every time you had to reduce the imagination of all the tensions of the money, of the shock, of hurting somebody else. Every time you made that effort less for the person, so that they were actually living in the world, that is what scaled up to be closer to reality, to the point where, in the condition where you met the person, you felt the electric shock yourself, the money was on the table in front of you, so everything about the paradigm was real except for the shocks were not actually delivered, then there was no statistical difference between what you did in real time versus what you did in this very hyper reality, but was still imaginary. But that was just one test bed, and we're doing some experiments now where we're working on social networks and cognitive maps, and this is not an answer, but if you come to me in a year's time, I can maybe give you an answer. But we're trying to understand, and a lot of this actually work is inspired by some of the work that IDA's done on successor representations, the building of cognitive maps, and what they afford us when we're moving about our social networks and navigating them. So we've done it in artificial networks in the lab, where we build these essentially mini networks of 10, 15, sometimes 20 people. But we're actually now following a cohort. We're going to be this September following a cohort of incoming brown freshmen who will start with a network where they don't know anybody, so they have no friends, and they're going to build their network over the course of the year, and it will presumably stabilize. And we're going to test our models in real time of this incoming freshman cohort as they build their social network, and we'll see whether our models that happen in these little 15-person networks that are totally artificial also can operate and help people socially navigate their own networks as they learn about them in real time. But that's just two examples, one of which I don't have an answer to, of how we try to scale up in complexity. But it's a tough thing, and it's something that we're thinking about constantly and trying to both manage our own expectations and be true to what happens in the real world.
At Brown, isn't that where everyone makes friends immediately? Isn't it the friendliest campus in the world? But it really matters.
No.
No, but it's really
we're interviewing all these freshmen now. All the freshmen RAs in our lab, and it's like Dynasty, that TV show, but 2022.
And your work also has real implications, right, for moving into the world of simulation, right? I mean, you could imagine that the kind of work you do could be used in sketchy ways, right? You could imagine employers and government agencies sort of running some of these experimental paradigms on people's axes of how they decide and make decisions about whether they'll make a good pilot or they'll be a good business person. So in other words, the stakes are high, aren't they, in terms of the mapping between the experiments, the simulations, and the real world ecological context, right? I mean, it just seems like you're in that space, which it has real world applications. I mean, I'm sure you get approached.
Totally.
I mean, I'm not going to ask you if you get approached by DARPA or anything like that, but I could imagine that the world really would like some decision-making assays along all these axes that could be predictive of how people will be in a difficult situation in the real world.
Right. I think you're right. Yeah.
So, Oriel, a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
The account that is controlled by Black Women in AI is asking, did the experiment study the amount and length of time of shock? So, for instance, if you're giving multiple shocks, or the duration is longer versus shorter, and what are those effects?
Sure, yeah. So the duration of the shock is always the same, but there were 20 shocks, the possibility of administering 20 shocks that could increase in their power. So you could give a very painful shock, and that would allow you to keep more money. Or you could give a very mild, almost harm, it's like almost like a tickle to the wrist. and that would cost you very little to do. So yes, it scaled up in the shock's power, but not in its intensity. I should also say that we checked how people felt about the shock before they went into, like how the decider felt about the shock before going in, and their experience of the shock, which we only gave them like one low-level shock, had no predictive value on their ultimate decision to be altruistic or selfish in the task itself. And everybody has a very different threshold for how painful they found it.
Very cool. So before we go to the questions from the audience, I'll ask a couple of questions. If John, are you?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, this is, you know, it's so interesting that I'd always detect when I could ask questions forever. So yes, thank you. It's really fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you.
So what I wanted to ask is, first of all, great talk and great work. I really like this conceptually, this idea that various different kind of approaches, and mathematically Boris Gotkian has done that, which is the idea that there is an internal landscape and it's multidimensional. So it could be, I need to be warm. I need to not be like colder than a certain amount to stay alive. I need to have a certain amount of sugar in my blood not to die. I need to, and so there's like, you know, almost like a hierarchy of needs. And then there is, I guess, another internal landscape. I want to not be in, for instance, position of pain. And there is some level of pain that maybe kills me, but like there's a large range that might not. But nonetheless, it could be like also an emotional landscape. So I'm imagining a hierarchy instead of one landscape of just like temperature and sleep and like, you know, sugar, which is like a three-dimensional landscape. I'm imagining different layers that are connected to each other, because just being well-fed and warm and not being in pain and having slept enough doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to be in a pleasant state. There could be so many other things going on. And I wonder whether, and then obviously their idea is that whatever is happening in the external world, instead of having rewards at all, we can think about how something in the external world, some stimulus in the external world, would correspond to minimizing the distance to dangerous zones in my internal landscape. Mm-hmm. And then there's some ideal points or some ideal parts of it that you want to minimize your distance to that. If I'm hungry, then grabbing food is going to minimize my distance. But if I'm very sleep deprived, food is not going to help. And if I'm extremely cold and I might freeze, if you give me money, it's not going to avoid me from freezing, for instance. I'm imagining that your work is almost like another layer on top of that. And it is related because you mentioned there's physiological correspondence to emotions too. So if I'm hungry, my arousal levels might change, the pleasantness might change. But it's almost like on top of it, because even if all of those were well fed, even if I'm in my ideal point homeostatically in terms of metabolism and whatnot, I could still emotionally be in a different point. So I wonder whether you think there's some kind of emotional homeostasis that we are trying to kind of manage. And I guess in that emotional homeostasis, sometimes because it's a multidimensional state space, right. For instance, John's mom might need for her emotional homeostasis to have some level of prediction errors or some pattern or schema or narrative structure of prediction errors of emotions going up and down in order for her to manage her, let's say, emotional homeostasis or get closer to her ideal state, for instance.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think of that kind of a perspective where it's almost like hierarchy of needs, but translated to this internal landscape. And it really highlights a couple of things. First, that rewards are not one-dimensional and not unitary. In spite of the fact that, of course, we can have some studies and show that there's some part of the brain that treats everything the same, but nonetheless, it's not really. And it also gives us a perspective on how to address different dimensions of this internal landscape, that different things in the external world are going to correspond to some sense of movement in that internal landscape.
Okay. Yeah, so that's interesting because it speaks to, you know, John's other question about a meta prediction error, right? Sort of wanting of this, of maybe, you know, there's some people who desire having, you know, high emotional experiences and low emotional experiences. And there's people who prefer sort of to be, you know, more flat. So I think that's I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the idea that reward is multidimensional could be captured by this potentially emotional single turning external rewards like money into something that the body, the mind, the brain construes as value. And when I think about, I don't study AI, and this is not my field, so I'm a little wary to like sort of, dip my toes into this too much in this conversation. But, one of the amazing things about AI is that you can take AI with a certain goal, and you can have an AI system outperform a human. But when the context change, they can no longer outperform in Go compared to a human, right? So when the context change, when the goal is slightly different, this AI system, this computer is no longer as powerful as a human. And so when I think about, reward in these cases where, these AI machines are maximizing on reward, what is the difference between what a human is doing that can change its context, can change whether, it wants to feel an emotional high, it has multiple different needs, just as you're describing, Ida, like all of these different things are filtered through an emotion, right? An emotional experience, whether that's conscious or unconscious. And this idea that that an emotional violation helps you change the goal, recalibrate what the reward out in the environment actually is in an external way, to figure out whether it is indeed valuable given these homeostatic changes of now I'm thirsty, now I'm tired, whatever it might be, I think is part of the reason that there's this huge divergence between what humans can do and what AI can do.
Thank you. That actually makes sense. And would you think that mathematically that would be, I think that it would be interesting to actually do that kind of a mathematical model where some physiological needs and some pleasantness that is not going to kill you, watching a horror movie is not going to kill anyone unless maybe they have a heart attack. But it seems like it's different kinds of homeostasis that we are trying to maintain simultaneously. Mm-hmm. I wonder whether we could model that, and I wonder whether you have an idea of how we could run experiments on that. Like if you ran the same experiment while people were hungry or very cold or had their hands in a cold bucket before, or their cortisol levels were somehow different, or they took some medication that modified their neurotransmitters, it would be different because another level is interacting with this level of emotions. And I also wonder, to the point of reasoning, and now coming from the perspective of reasoning, I think that maybe something that certain reasoning points create is another kind of homeostasis, which is predictability or rules that I understand. So let's say that I am at a time where I cannot, where I'm a logical entity, and I cannot reconcile the fact that I might, let's say, see two different points coming out of a particle that I measured, and with the fact that I'm expecting it based on my reason for it to go there. And I might need to create a new theory and incorporate that into my reasoning that, hey, sometimes particles behave in this strange way. And like, we have Schrodinger and we have some particular aspects of physics. So it violates reasonable things, but we kind of change our theories of what's reasonable in the world in order to meet that. Even though logic is a little bit more rigid, but there is also possible world logic, which is modal logic, which says, possible world where this and that happens, then if we keep everything the same, what is going to be changing, right? So I wonder what you think about modeling on the one hand of these kind of different, maybe different different levels of homeostasis that we are trying to simultaneously maintain, and how certain schemas or practices might move us in certain directions in compromising one versus other. Because as we know, historically, many times rationality seems to sacrifice emotions. So I would love to hear what you think.
So that's, I mean, look, I fully well, I shouldn't say fully. I very much subscribe to the computational practice because I think it brings the precision that's very necessary to these types of concepts, and dealing with them, it forces us to commit or to like really test what a hypothesis is. Where I am wary of it is in against the same point of complexity of how you do it in a meaningful way, where you can actually capture the variables that you want to show you something meaningful about what you're actually studying. And so I think that's the goal, but I don't think that I don't have a solution at hand. That being said, what you just described, Ida, struck me as a very interesting experiment, because what you can do is you can totally manipulate homeostatic states all over in many different ways, whether it be hunger or adding in a stressor. Even having, you could look at phasic versus tonic stressors. There's so many interesting things talking about situations where you come to reconceptualize what the norm is when it comes to stress. That's an incredibly powerful space that completely can, destroy what was previously thought of as a landscape of life, and make you reconceptualize and have a new framework for how to adapt in, let's say, a stressful situation, whether it be short or long-lived. And so that would very much change, I think, the way that, let's say, emotion prediction errors or emotion as a signal might interact with guiding value, and making it more or less sensitive, essentially, to the type of choices that you make, and what you would do in dire cases for survival.
Right. So that's Ahmed. So we will get to you in a second. So I feel like the thing that you said about phasic versus tonic is very well taken. As in, for instance, if we all of a sudden globally increase uncertainty, there's different rules that apply, as it happened to all of us during COVID, right? Yes, it is allostasis versus homeostasis. John Roski, we should have you on screen. I don't know if you're, is it okay if we invite you on screen? I know there is a delay, but let's invite him anyway, because he seems to have worked with Boris Gotkin as well. So I think, like, changing uncertainty and such might really change the kind of, let's say, schema that would be helpful for either of them. So Ahmed, we're going to turn to you if you are around, because your camera just turned off. But
hi, yeah, I'm still here. I just thought if John had to ask a question first, I'd just probably better quickly. Sorry, get off the screen for a moment. Hello.
Hi. We can hear you. I can hear you.
Oh, hi. I think I'm still struggling a bit with how we're defining emotion in this context. Now, I unfortunately did lose connection for a bit and miss a small part of your talk. So I'm not sure if it was kind of addressed directly in that one bit and I kind of completely missed it. But something you said in the last, minute or so was that you find looking at things computationally seems to really appeal to you. And there's a paper that I mentioned when John, I think, was asking for his predictions about predictions, that basically is a very good, I think, a very good computational account of mood generally. And
can you repeat?
Is this Iran Eldar's paper?
Sorry,
can you tell us what the paper is? Because Oriel wasn't looking at the chat the whole time.
Oh,
if it's the neurocomputational account of mood, it must be Yael and Iran Eldar's paper, right?
No, I think it was James Clark, Friston, and I can't remember who the third author is, but I think there's three of them. The basic.
Can you put it in the chat so that I'm not aware of this paper?
I can try to put it again, but I'm
sorry.
on iPad, so my screen options.
Okay, I'll go back into the thing. Oh, here, I think I found it.
If you want me to summarize it very briefly, if I'm remembering it right,
please.
It's basically that I think they understood emotion as, the valence being whether your predictions are met or violated. And then mood being kind of like a second level above emotion, as being predictions about those first order predictions. So essentially, the first question is whatever prediction that you can make, and then the second question above that being, do you think you can predict the world? Is the world predictable or not? Because an unpredictable world is an unpleasant world, a predictable one being a pleasant one. And they kind of they see mood not just as that on that one axis, but the other axis also being precision, which, but my background is not in research, although I think I got catfished into being a physician. But for me, looking at, for example, bipolar disorder or different sort of depressive or anxiety, disorders, that account seems to make a lot of sense, especially for bipolar, because you can have, so they define, for example, mania as really high precision for predictions with a good sort of outcome, like basically your predictions being met. You're very sure that everything that you predict is going to be met. But because those two axes, the content of your predictions and the precision, or how sure you are of that prediction, are a bit separate or disassociated, you can have mixed mood states, which you also have in mania, where you're very sure that the world is unpredictable and you're very sure that the world is predictable in a sense. It's that being very sure initially. But I'm kind of going on a tangent here. I think what I was trying to ask really is, I was trying to understand how you are defining emotion, and when you kind of threw in arousal into the mix, I wondered what the sort of computational consequences of that concept of arousal are in this context. I think that's probably the simplest way to put it without sort of going on for much longer.
Just for clarification, so are you asking, is predictability an internal dimension of pleasantness? Are you saying the more predictable my models of the world, the more predictable the world is, the more pleasantness I experience? Is that what you're saying?
So that's what I mean. That's part of what that paper says. It says, a more predictable world is more pleasant, but also another aspect of that is how sure you are of that prediction that you've just stated there.
Right. So
what I'm asking about,
the world is predictable, and I'm sure about this. I'm not uncertain. Then you're saying that these two dimensions define the pleasantness that Oriel is saying?
No, I'm not saying that they define it. I'm trying to ask how exactly she's using the concept of arousal, and what the consequences of that in terms of their effects on prediction are.
I see.
Does that make sense?
I see. You're asking, what is the relationship between arousal and pleasantness and predictability and its precision?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
So can you see my screen again?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. So we define emotion by saying core affect, which is essentially, core affect is defined in a multidimensional way by valence, which is unpleasant to pleasantness, and by arousal from high to low. So like sleepiness would be down here, and excitement is up here, and fear and anger over here. And core affect has a conscious component to it, but it doesn't have to be appraisal per se, in the sense that you're appraising the emotion given its context, and therefore reinstating that emotional experience as fear as an example. But mood and emotion are two different things. So mood is a stable long-term experience, right? So if I'm extremely excited, or let's say stressed out, that's often an emotion in the moment. It can be longer than, let's say, a moment, but mood is something that spans hours, days, weeks, whatever it might be, which has a very different qualitative experience emotionally than an emotion itself, which is more fleeting than a mood. Mood comes into the picture, I think, a bit more for when you started talking about, something like bipolar disorder. that's where, you know, mood from a mental health perspective is really important to consider, because can be instability, as you discussed. Now, I haven't read this paper, so I would have to go back and look at what they are, you know, offering up with the computational account of mood, and what that sort of gains us in the knowledge domain. But I do think that there is differences between mood and emotion. And when we are studying emotion in this case, we're studying it in the moment of like a trial. So within like a 10-second frame, basically, in its ability to move a decision around, whether you're punishing or forgiving someone, or, you know, being selfish to them or whatnot. And in data that I actually didn't show here, but you know, Joey's found that, so we have these these trajectories of the mouse, and we can see how quickly people move and with what trajectory they move from one space to another. And so one of the analyses that Joey's done in this particular paper is he looks at how quickly, if you're deciding to, let's say, punish or to accept the offer in the ultimatum game, how soon in that trajectory is it differentiated between accepting and punishing? And what he finds is that, you know, under 2 seconds, like within a second and a half or a second and a quarter or something, you can already predict, before you even get to the end point of wherever you're headed, what you're going to do, whether you're going to punish or not. So these emotions, which are much more fleeting, are very powerful in a way that, you know, I mean, mood's powerful in a different way, but I wouldn't equate mood and emotion to be the same thing.
Ahmed, feel free to respond if you want, Ahmed.
Yeah, I'm aware of that distinction between mood and emotion. I think I'm still struggling to. I mean, we all kind of have, I guess, like a basic kind of lived understanding of what you mean by sort of pleasant or unpleasant. You know, that one sort of dimension on that you know, grid that you have there. What I'm asking about, I think, is that other dimension of arousal, and what it actually computationally means, because that, I think, is it's a bit more difficult, I think, to just have like really well defined, if you know what I mean. And the reason that I brought in mood earlier is because just thinking about that account in that other paper where they involve precision weighting as a very, you know, not just sort of like an afterthought, but like you know, one of two main dimensions of mood, which I get is not the same necessarily as emotion. But if we're trying to define emotion and we need a more solid computational definition of that, then I wonder whether there's, you know, an equal, or whether it's, you know, it's possibly equally important to start thinking about precision weighting as well. So
your basic point, as I understand it, is you prefer the two axes that Friston and co. had for mood, whereas you feel like the two axes we've learned about today for emotion, one of them is too loosey-goosey for you. Is that basically what you're saying? And you'd like it to live up to the precision axis for mood. You'd like the arousal axis to have that computational definition, right? That seems to me what you're saying is that arousal isn't rising up to the standard as a computational variable. Is that basically what you're saying?
Like you're drawing a parallel between this and that model, and you're saying precision there was easier defined than arousal here. Is that what you're asking?
It's not a matter of comparing to and saying I like this one more, and that's the point I'm trying to make. It's more that because I do find that it's difficult to talk about emotions without.
Sorry, that's not what we're saying. We're not just saying you like it more. We're saying you're saying it's computationally easier to define.
It is, but I think there's some, you can't really talk about emotion without talking about arousal. But then,
sure. But is that what you're saying? You're saying you want a more clearly defined computational notion of arousal. That's what you're saying, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So one way that I can, before Oriel answers, one thing I can say is that in many computational models, arousal can be a sharpening or like higher arousal is kind of a sharpening or amplifying some of the signals. And sometimes low arousal would be injecting noise to the computational model, for instance. And you're right that there hasn't been a single way that people have modeled arousal. There are different ways that they've done it. But at the same time, I just wanted to highlight that sometimes just injecting noise versus sharpening helps. For instance, if you're looking visually and then it depends on the species. For instance, in predators, if you're highly aroused, meaning you're hunting, for instance, you might sharpen your foveal and then you don't look at the periphery as much. But if you're a prey animal, like mice, for instance, when you're aroused, you might better see the periphery because of the fact that you need to identify dangers, right? So you're totally right that arousal doesn't have a unified definition and it doesn't work in the same way. I just wanted to mention these examples that I have seen in the computational fields, that in the vision models or in terms of noise versus sharpening, and then pass it on to Oriel to mention hers. So would these be examples of arousal defined computationally for you also?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, go ahead, Oriel. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you answered that for me beautifully, Ida. And I would also, the only thing I can add to that, so thank you, is that when you remove arousal from the model in predicting choice, it does worse. So the best model includes arousal in predicting, actual behavior. And so it's, you might say, well, like, without sort of like, a computationally precise model of what we're going to call arousal, we're going to fail at that. And I can say, sure, that's true, and that could be true of lots of things, but also know that when you take it out of the model, it does, the model does worse at predicting actual behavior, so that it is adding something. So I would say that the arousal valence two-dimensional axis is a very sort of bread and butter way of conceptualizing emotion, whereas valence and precision is perhaps a little bit unorthodox or outside the box. It doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just different. But sort of the circumplex thing, which Russell came up with 35 years ago, whatever it was, is been shown on a neurobiological level as in a multidimensional way within the brain. There's a lot of evidence that emotion works on this two-dimensional space, and that's the strength of the evidence is one of the reasons that we picked this model when we had there's a lot to select from. There's a lot of emotion researchers who do not agree on what emotion is. But one of the reasons we picked it is because of the evidence in support of this 2D space.
Oriel, it's interesting. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, before we go to John Cooper, before John says something, I wanted to say, first of all, Ahmed, your question is a great computational question. And what I want to add is it's related potentially to neurotransmitters. Because, for instance, with norepinephrine versus dopamine, we have different dimensions getting involved. For instance, norepinephrine is very closely related to changes in arousal. Oh, Ahmed, we lost your, okay, you're back. We lost you for a second. So norepinephrine is very connected to arousal. So if I'm going around in the world and there are some rules I'm using and some reward schema that I'm using, all of a sudden, or some value schema I'm using, and all of a sudden, based on some task I'm doing, all of a sudden I notice something in the world. For instance, like, I don't know, like some animal jumps in on the road or something. Norepinephrine allows me to do something that in 2004, they called it circuit breaking. It allows me to switch from whatever rule I'm using into deciding between another rule or another schema to use for the new situation that came in. It increases arousal. It's associated with your pupil dilation, and it's been very beautifully modeled in models that you can find, especially Angela Yu, for instance, in UCSD has done beautiful computational models of it. Jonathan Cohen has done beautiful computational model of it that they've tested in rodents. Sonia Bishop at Berkeley, when she was still at Oxford, she did these studies with anxious individuals, very related to what you were saying. And she was looking at how much their pupils dilated when they were receiving shocks in an experiment. And she noticed that because their pupils weren't dilated in correspondence to the shocks, they weren't learning enough to avoid the shocks later on, unfortunately, which was very sad. But the pupil dilation, because of its connection to norepinephrine and arousal, has been used in these computational models as one of the measures of arousal, for instance, and as one of the measures of norepinephrine, which is separate from dopamine, but sometimes correlated, because when I might need also dopamine. So I think what you're saying is very interesting and brings maybe a new question to Oriel, which regards How would you consider, given you're a computational cognitive neuroscientist, on the neuroscience part, how would you consider measuring different neurotransmitters and circuits contributing to these different dimensions of arousal and pleasantness? For instance, dopamine might be along the reward prediction error a little bit more, but for instance, or maybe dopamine is closer to valence, but not entirely actually. But whereas norepinephrine might be a little closer to arousal, and their interaction might be nonlinear at times. So I feel like Ahmed has opened up a new question regarding incorporation of neurotransmitters, perhaps.
Sure, and also in its directionality, right? So like whether it's scalar or has a direction like a vector or something like that, some sort of value. I think dopamine, I have less clarity on the dopamine side of things. I think norepinephrine you make a really good case for that, and you can do things like pupil dilation. You also have SCR, which you can do physiological responses. There's a little bit of, the SCR, pupil dilation a little bit less so, but the SCR data in general as a function of arousal, I think is a little bit actually less clear than what we would have hoped. That data is fairly messy from my experience in terms of, both doing it, but also reading the literature and its lack of consistency across like decision variables of what you're capturing and what you're capturing when it comes to subjective value. But this comes back to the idea of this like multidimensional space of like what exactly is reward? Is it multidimensional, and can an emotion component capture some of that multidimensionality, and does it break down in different dimensions within the brain? So I don't have data yet. I was just talking to Joey right before this to see, we've run like 35 subjects in an EEG experiment right now where we're trying to capture on different time scales if we can pull out these reward and emotion prediction errors that happen in different ways or different time scales. We're also doing it in the scanner. But if we can find neurobiological support at whether it be time scales or in either in different regions, which I think is quite possible, striatally versus amygdala for some of the emotion prediction errors, or even if it is within the same region but has a different representational content depending on what the prediction error is, I think that would be additional good physiological evidence of the fact that reward is not enough, that it's not the end all be all of the way that we should be looking at learning and decision making. You look unconvinced. I don't know what more I can say to convince you. They're just ideas. We're working through them.
No, I get what you're saying. I think I still need to, I think just digest a bit of, just mentally digest a bunch, really.
So I think maybe in short, there are different ways to computationally have an axis of arousal. And one of them is by injecting noise versus sharpening. And this corresponds to models of norepinephrine. And behaviorally, it corresponds to behavioral measurement of pupil dilation. And when people make models of arousal that use either norepinephrine measurements or tonic or phasic or pupil dilation, what they do is basically they have some kind of a directionality, some kind of a dimension of simplified notion of arousal. Skin conductance response, which is the based on how much sweat there is in your hands, is another dimension that can be measured. Again, it can be just entered and modeled in an agent in terms of how much noise versus how much sharpening there is. And also between, are they using the same rule that they were, or are they looking for a better rule to switch because they realize something in the world has changed? So when things change, and this relates to what you were saying before, when predictability is reduced, meaning when things change, you need increased arousal in order to make things more predictable again. So if you want to translate it to the terms that you were saying. And the more uncertainty you have about predictability, that's like the tonic arousal being modulated. But the more in a moment something changes and I can find the predictable, if I find the right model or schema of what's going on or task that's going on, then I can correct it back. And in agents, this is as simple as an agent that's doing dual tasks for instance, right? It doesn't need to be very complicated to model it. Then you can model it in terms of increasing the signal and also looking for a better rule, for instance. So there are different ways to model arousal. You're totally right that it's not, it's just like, there's not one way to do it. but there definitely have been a huge literature. And I don't know what stage you are or what your field is, but if you ever were doing a PhD in computational neuroscience, you can definitely do an entire PhD on exactly the question that you're asking.
Someday.
Someday. John Kubi, we're so excited to have you here again.
Hi. I feel a little guilty yesterday. I've been mind wandering a bit during this, enjoying the word emotion is a trigger for me, and it elicits an emotional response. And 15 years ago, the response was a sort of a happiness, because I thought my readings on it, which are sort of neighborly, I thought people were coming together and getting some Russell's paper and others were all coming together. Now, 15 years later or so, the emotional response is sadness, because it seems to have exploded in about 10 directions, at least from the neuroscience side. And there are really at least 5 conflicting definitions of what an emotion is. There's Jola-Do, where it's totally conscious, there's no unconscious, just defined that way. And others, around the clock, and Damasio, where it's really the output of its movements and things like that. And there's feeling is what most people call emotion. So it's really problematic. My guess now is the reason emotion is just a word, human invented word. And my guess is it's not a good word for what we're going for. It has to be cut up into subcategories to make more sense of. And one subcategory that I've thought about, and triggered a little bit by Marcia Nussbaum writing on emotion, totally different kind of thing, is human emotions and emotions towards other people and agents. And the rough framework, as I think about it, is that each has a goal, something in distance, I want to achieve something, and their agents will either help me get to the goal, those are the people I like, my friends, make me happy, and those who interfere, and those are the ones I really get mad at. And the prototypical thing I think of over and over is road rage, because everyone we all would agree that's an emotion of some sort. It's extreme, it's really crazy. So, so this is in the category of these social dynamic things where there's an agent who's getting in your way of going home, which is your project or something like that. And my guess is that's a really different category of thing than the kinds of things you're looking at. And when you get to social emotions, that's much closer to it. Does that fit in at all? Rather than just calling, let me, an aside, not all hedonic responses are emotional. I mean, do I have you could say they are. If I like apples, I see an apple, it makes me sort of, happy. It doesn't feel so emotional, or I'm tired and I'm going to go to bed and lie down. That might or might not qualify as a real good prototype of an emotional response. I think of emotional response mostly in terms of reactions to people and social things, and that's the core of what I would see. And anyway, there are issues about really defining the term. My guess is it's just we have to come together with some cohesive ideas before we can get to modeling and that kind of level of analysis.
Ooh, I don't know if you're going to get to a cohesive group of effective scientists agreeing to what emotion is. I can't imagine that being the case. But I also, I think what you're raising some interesting points, but I want to push back at them, because I don't really see there being like a prototypical, archetypical type of emotion, right? That, like with the road rage example that you gave. I think that the beauty of emotion is that it can be expansive, but it can also be minimal. And just because an emotion might be minimal doesn't make it might make its operational power in relative to something like road rage less potent, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a governing property over the types of actions or choices or movements that we're making, even if the emotion itself is minimal. I certainly don't have any evidence to suggest otherwise, but I'm open to the possibility of it. But I think that, in some ways, emotion's a difficult thing because nobody can agree on what a definition is. And in some ways that's okay, because if you take something and you apply some sort of math to the emotional experience, then you don't have to agree to what the definition of emotion is, and you can just work with it. And that's kind of the beauty of merging, math with nebulous terms like emotion, is that you can get around these sort of sticky things of having to get everybody to agree to what exactly an emotion is.
So Ariel,
Well,
sorry, John, maybe this example, John Kubi, I want to ask you a question. If you touch a hot stove, you have both high arousal and it's unpleasant, but no other social situation is involved, right? Would you consider that an emotion?
Probably not.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you consider emotion to be only when other people are involved?
No, I think everyone, what's her name? Barrett Feldman talks about going to different cultures and asking if the language, and they don't map at all. So it seems like a lot of emotions are language constructs that we agree upon. Doesn't mean we're cutting it at the bone. And that's really what I'm bringing up. And everyone loves to go to reductionistic approaches if we have a core essence of something, but the reductionist approach may miss some of the essentials.
Can I just, there are just, I'm listening to this and it's getting towards the end of the session, so I don't mind how ignorant and outrageous what I'm about to say is, but, it's so interesting to me. I mean, I know Luis Pessoa has cared a lot about, right, the sort of cognition and emotion, and then there's a lot of people who care a lot about embodiment, embodied cognition, the body, right? But listening to you today, and I have to admit, I've never really thought a lot about emotion, but I'm beginning to think that emotion is the price you pay for having a body and a sensory system that goes beyond reason. In other words, that it's all the things that aren't clear, cold, logical reasons that also matter to you when you're in a body existing in the world, right? In other words, you cash out your perceptual system and your life in a body in a set of emotional dimensions that aren't just cold reasons. And it's interesting, right? Because no one thinks that any of the AIs that we all get excited about have emotions. AlphaGo didn't go, yes, I won. So in other words, it's really interesting that maybe you just can't exist in a moving, perceiving body and not have emotions in addition to just cognitive reasons. And maybe the reason why we're never going to come up with a definition of emotion is because there are so many dimensions to the fact of having a body with sensations and perceptions. And emotion should be no more defined than the word cognition can be, or the word intelligence can be. These are protean notions. And then the last one I'd like to make is, we had Jessica Flack on in a really great session recently. And we were having a discussion about when can you coarse grain and screen off without more reductionist explanations of things. And one of the arguments we got into was, like you just said, Oriel, which is, if these axes do good predictive experimental work, in other words, arousal versus valence, and they seem to get traction in terms of results and explanatory traction as well, maybe we don't need to go beyond those operational things. So maybe we have to exist in a non-reductionist definition. We just need to be operational like you've been. The proof is in whether you can get new work out of it. And then third, maybe emotion is just all the things that aren't reasons that happen in a moving, feeling body. And we're never going to come down to one particular definition.
So I think what you're saying is not outlandish at all, first of all. And second of all, I would even go so far as to say, why does it matter? I know some effective scientists stake their careers on this, but I would argue, why does it matter that we have to have congruency on what the experience of anger or satisfaction or excitement is? Why does that matter when it is clear that whatever emotion is, however we want to define it, whatever language you want to use or not use, is powerful in shaping the choices that we make? Do we have to have an alignment? Is my experience of being enthusiastic the same as yours? No, it will not be. It never will be. And nor it will be sad or disappointment, and nor will my experience in time point A be the same as being sad and disappointed then as in time point B. But I don't actually think that's important.
Yeah, it's like the word art, right? In other words, you know, if artists couldn't get on with it until they knew what art was defined as, we'd be in a real pickle, right? And so that doesn't make the concept of art unuseful, right? In other words, I don't think that it's so vague that it doesn't do work. I think it does. So I just wonder whether we're learning here that if you want to do human cognitive science, and we have to use terms like intelligence and art and emotion, then maybe the best is to sort of just locally operationalize like you are, rather than having to find some definition that we all need to agree upon. I mean, in philosophy, that's long since gone away. Philosophers have long since left the world of defining things precisely before you can start arguing. It used to be the case, right? But nowadays, stay fuzzy, you know?
Well, I would argue that I don't think you should stay fuzzy. So I think, you know, in the field that I, you know, more narrowly started off in, which was morality, you know, it's again the same issue. We suffer from the same issue: is how you define what is moral. And you can get a million different people, from philosophers to neuroscientists, defining what is moral. But again, I would say I don't really think it matters if we can learn something about the way that the human mind works when we're dealing with moral-esque tensions, however we define them. That doesn't mean they need to be fuzzy. That means that when I say I'm being altruistic, which falls under the penumbra term morality, it looks like X or it looks like Y. I would argue the same. We can do the same thing with emotion. We don't have to have a definition. We all don't have to agree on the same definition. Yet we can still, if we can find some sort of properties that we agree on, some quantifiable ways, some measurement stick. You might not agree with the way that I measured it, and that's a different story. And I'm happy to debate that. But we don't have to agree on what the definition is, so long as you agree that there's some tractability in the way that I try to measure what emotion might or might not be.
The definition of emotion is what computers don't have.
Wait.
There you go.
Let's not get too fuzzy. But okay, so Ahmed is asking something that I think is actually helpful. He's asking, and let me translate it into our world a little bit. So what he's asking is acute social defeat and acute reactive aggression, both are negative valence and high arousal, but they're different. One is fear and one is anger. What I understand is that in very kind of, for instance, John Kubi would know this, like in animals also, anger would be that you're doing something or drive to do something, and fear would be usually you're like running away or hiding. So the kind of response, the kind of policy or action you're giving in response might be different. So I wonder whether, Oriel, you think that there is another dimension that can dissociate fear versus anger in your emotional landscape.
I love this question. The answer is no.
That's
so we
important then.
So Joey just also had, I'm going to give Joey another plug here. Joey has this other beautiful paper that just came out where he used neural networks to backwards figure out what basically to reverse engineer or figure out what emotions people were feeling without having to rely on some sort of like labeling system. And I want you to know that in our, I'm going to share my screen again. In his data, anger and fear are very confused. And wait, hold on a second. Where do I find that? Share the screen. I have to go to myself. Sorry, one sec. I'm just gonna plug all of Joey's work here. Can you see it?
Yes.
My screen. Okay, sorry. This is like the screen itself. But so we basically use, you know, the circumplex again in a very similar way. So hold on, where is angry? Angry is here. And where is, oh, he may have stripped back for the, let's see. Okay, so now I'm not making my argument very well at all. But the point is that when we look at the ability to classify these emotions using neural networks, what we find is that where people put angry and fear on this circumplex, the models confuse them entirely. And so my only point here is that essentially what happens is that when we're trying to sort of like quote unquote reverse engineer this space, we have a lot of difficulty because they do, just as Ahmed said, they do fall very much aligned in a similar, very negatively aroused and negatively valent space, but they have two totally different motivational properties. And so the answer to there is that if you look at it in these contexts where you just have like, you apply some sort of model and you call it a day, you're not going to get much out of it. But then in those types of scenarios, context matters greatly, right? So the goal or whatever the environmental properties are will define whether the experience is angry or fear, essentially. And so, yeah.
But there is a difference if I'm designing an agent and the agent is going to take some action. There is a different action or different type of policy that the agent would do if it's angry versus if it's fearing. One might hide in one or run away, and in the other one might fight.
Right. And so my point is that when you take these models and you just put them in without context, without knowing whether you are, outside of a bar in a dark alleyway being like pursued by someone, whichever that context is, in which a model or a computational model or a neural network or whatever it might be is not privy to. I mean, the human body is, but those models are not privy to that type of situation versus, being in a heated argument that gets you up into the same space on a circumplex, rating your emotion in the same way. The context of, being in a yelling match with your spouse is a completely different context. And so therefore context or goal defines the motivational property of yell louder or run down the alleyway or whatever. And so maybe this comes back to what was being said earlier, which is there an omega variable emotion that can really operate? And maybe what we're coming to now in a full circle like way is that the answer is in some ways no, because without that contextual properties, anger and fear would give you a very confused way of response that would end up in your demise potentially. And so you need some of these extra bells and whistles and these complexities to efficiently and adaptively navigate.
So that's great. And also Samantha Walters in the chat says, both are negative arousal and negative valence, but fear maybe has higher uncertainty. So she's considering.
So you could say there's a three axis. What if you add in arousal and valence and precision, and maybe you have your perfect trifecta?
Yeah, I think that's what Ahmed had been saying, and he also says something that's similar to your answer. He's saying maybe something like self-esteem or like another kind of tonic inner experience is what determines what you're gonna do in reaction to your negative valence and negative arousal, whether it's gonna be this or that. And in relation to these beautiful comments that these folks are asking, maybe Ahmed should apply to work with you, actually. With regards to these questions, I'm wondering, and going back to what John was saying from the beginning, there is this kind of idea since Plato of this idea of the black horse and the white horse, and that, emotion and reason, and then you have to control them both. Do you think that reason and rationality or some kind of schema or some kind of narrative can be used to regulate emotions? What do you think about generally using reason and rationality as emotional regulation? I want to bring John Kubi's point again here as well, that in the definition of or cultural differences in clustering of emotions as negative or positive, like how do we define these things? Obviously, we can't claim universality, but regardless, when you are based on whatever you've been socialized with to understand as positive or negative emotions, is there a possibility of using reason to overcome it, regulate it, or instead of acting on it, act on some other principle. John Kubi on mic. So do you want to say something, John?
Yeah, I was going to point out that great example of Zahmed's example of different reactions. The other animals are agents, and that they are really fundamentally different than objects and things in the environment. You have to predict their behavior. You have to, that's really part of the whole thing. It's predictive, not just what will happen if I do this. You have to get, have prediction about the other agents. It's really such a much more complicated situation. I think my guess is it's a really fundamentally different category, and it's sort of evolutionarily baked in. It's not something you just model and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but to add also to that complexity is, what happens when you're with that argument with your spouse and you're saying, I'm not annoyed, so you're saying one thing, but you have this emotional, or you're like, whatever. I mean, there's the complexities of the human experience is like filled with all sorts of layers that are not what they seem. And that makes part of the problem of the social domain particularly difficult and challenging.
I first want to thank Samantha and Ahmed for this fantastic contribution, especially Ahmed has been like really nicely bringing together a couple of, I hope you don't have COVID.
No. I inhaled a potato chip.
And John Kubi, I really want to thank you because I
Sorry.
I think it's interesting that you're talking about evolutionary sources of these physiological responses that we call emotions, and the cultural kind of clustering or definition of how to tag or interpret certain physiological responses. And I think children's development might have a lot to do with this. And also the practices that one takes. For instance, if you meditate a lot, you consider the state of just sitting and doing nothing an important state in your life. But if you are raised in a kind of a very fast-paced consumer culture, that might feel like being a loser of sitting and just doing nothing, staring at the wall, right? And also
one anecdote I think about is in children in development. Your child falls and hits his head on the table. Exactly. If you're mad at the table, they treat it as an agent.
I'll see your example and I raise it by one. My nieces, sometimes when they fall, they don't cry immediately. They look around at other people to see what the other people are expecting them to do. And sometimes if you start laughing at the child and be like, yay, you're going to get up, the child is not going to cry. The child is just going to laugh also and get up. And I think I love these videos of children when they're getting their ears pierced or something, that people trick them to think that nothing is happening, for instance. And I think those add to the example that you were providing. It's almost like there is some biological thing, but there's also, they have to be socialized to see what is negative and what is not. And they look at adults before even showing a reaction sometimes. All right.
Thoughts are negative, but really interesting directions and points of exploration. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you so much for your contribution, and great points for future thoughts about the relationship between evolutionary responses, neurotransmitters that are common across mammals, and the culturalization of how we categorize those brain states, those mammalian brain states that are way older than us, and their relationship to particular practices, be it meditation, be it like system 2 type of reasoning, how they help to regulate those things. Fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, Oriel. We've kept you 8 minutes after 6 already. Thank you, John, and thank you, Ahmed and Samantha, and everyone else who participated in the chat and asked questions.
And thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
It's our pleasure. And please go ahead if you want to say something to wrap us up and close us out. Please go ahead.
No, I thought this was great. I had a really wonderful time chatting with you, and you asked only softball questions. What's that about? I was expecting so much more. So thank you for being easy on me. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk in such depth about questions that I think a lot about and that are near and dear to me, and especially to get these fresh perspectives. And I love this idea as adding precision as a third dimension, and whether that might capture it differently, because I think about uncertainty a lot, and I hadn't thought about it in that third way. And so, of course, there's a balance between, explaining things as with as few variables as possible. But I really like the idea, and I think we'll probably follow up with some work on that as well. So thank you. This has been a very insightful and wonderful couple of hours. So thank you for having me.
Not at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being
Bye.
here. See you everyone next week. We're gonna have a book called, we're gonna discuss Sarah Mitnick's book, which is called The Power of the Downstate. She's a sleep researcher, professor at UC Irvine. So I hope to see everyone there next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. I'm very